Okay. As elementary as it is, um, there are a few things you want to consider. Even just right after you've made the principal decision, yes, we need a change. And before you go about executing or implementing or designing it, what's true for creating workflow stands true also here for modifying it, for changing it. And that is that you need the business to get behind whatever it is you're doing. The business is the justification for it all, and you want to get them on board early. If they're not the initiators of the change themselves, which is many times the case, if the change is coming from the technical, the IT side, then you definitely want to get the business people on board as early as possible, because without them, it won't work. Okay. The next thing you want to consider, as elementary as it is and as obvious as it is, we've seen too many times, when you just think, oh, this is just a small change and I don't have to involve the DBA and I don't have to involve whoever it is that does backups or the backup execute team. You can't have too much backup. When you're considering a change, not every change, of course, has to, you have to go the whole 9 yards. But when you're considering a change, deliberate with yourself the risk management. Deliberate it with your team. Is what I'm doing risky? And depending on that, you have to consider how deep you need the backup to go. Consider the database changes. Consider the physical files that you're going to be changing. And if the change is, of course, major enough, talking about major version updates, then you need to plan out there the different stages when you implement it, when you test it, what your rollback stages are, and of course, most critically for all of those, in the production environment. Another high-level item, which so many times we've seen is disregarded or initially created and then not updated later, is documentation. For every workflow you create, the best practice is to create a workflow document detailing all of the technical aspects. Well, we'll get to that in just 1 second. Before we continue, I'll show you a demo, a document of how you can do this. If you have them, then we'll go over how to use them. If you don't have them, then this document, which will later be available as part of the webinar downloads, you can use it as a template for creating them. So as many times happens, a developer comes in late in the game towards workflow modifications. The documentation is missing or lacking. Now's the time to look at the workflow, update the documentation or create it, and most importantly, it's an ongoing effort. It's like a diet. You have to keep it up or it will go stale after a while. Let's have a look at a typical design document. It's based on the fictitious Contoso company, and it goes like this. Generally speaking, you want to this is an official company document with a single point of contact. We'll go over the table of contents later. You want to have a proper version control of it over the document. As silly as it is, people change things around. This is personal experience shows that it's vital to find who did and who intended to do what. At later stages, there are going to be reviewers and approvals, all of the officialdom. But let's get down to the important stuff. You want to detail over here the naming, the background. In other words, what the business of it is, what will be considered a success or a failure at the end of this. Is of course a document. It's correct for the initial creation and for the modification. What will be considered a success? You want to write in the scope. Sometimes more importantly is not what you include, but what you're not going to include. because there's a tendency to spread out. So when you create a workflow for adding, for managing expenses, then somebody will come along halfway through and say, why don't we make it accessible from the, this is an old document, PDAs, from your BlackBerry or from your iPhone, and you can sort of spread out and ultimately be late when you're dealing with this. The scope has to include the yeses and the nos, the agreed yeses and the phase 2, the nos, which will be, of course, the base for phase 2 and for future updates. You want to look at the risks. In other words, if you're detailing it over here, each project, when you're talking about interfacing with a different technology, perhaps it's old, perhaps it's going to slow us down, perhaps it's unreliable. So if you're talking about legacy technologies, if the workflow itself can be as fast as ever, but if you're dependent on an old system that's slowing you down by 80%, then you haven't done anything. And this is the place to put in the risk, to sit down and think where the weak points are and to plan for them, the contingencies, and in the design of the workflow, how you plan around those engineering problems. The stakeholders are also vitally important. If you intend for a workflow to serve 2 or 3 different divisions, and you don't have the managers, the people with the cloud in those divisions behind you, getting behind you to plan and to use the workflow, then chances are that the workflow will not be optimally designed. You want a careful timeline for this. In this case, it was delegated to the appendix, but it's vitally important. There have to be milestones. If a project is 2 or 3 months, then you want to prepare 5 or 6 milestones in the middle. If it is a first design that you can see, that you can click through, and then the interfacing, and then the SQL side optimization. Each project is unique in that sense, but you want to make it you want to make a few milestones so you can see that you're on time, and you're not going off track and find it only towards the deadline. We don't have to go over all of this over here. This is some of this is particular. When you're going through the workflow, before you drag it all onto the canvas, you should have it over here. Each step, you can see that this is a work in progress. There's deletions and everything, and that's fine. That's how it's supposed to be. Each step with its own description. We're not talking about who's linked to who or everything, but an overall idea of what each step is about. And in this case, I see they were given just numeric IDs. You can go about this a different way. Of course, the type over here is the different activity types. Again, there's a lot of variation you can go about over here. An important bit is the structure for each of these. So in this case, we have a web service listener, and we want to really go into the depth of it. You want to have the schema, and inside of it exactly what it's expecting to receive and what its input and output is. It's vitally important. If you look at this later on and you read this and you prepare your document, again optimized to what you want it to do, then you don't have to go digging through the workflow to understand what sort of data and data types you're going to be trading with your systems and between your own activities. The workflow roles here too. Many times I've seen this as a sort of intuitive idea towards the end. Okay, who are we going to give permissions to what? And then it's just a tug of war, a little bit here, a little bit to there, and it's never consistently designed, so that you might have a workflow that would be so much better served if there was a little bit more of information sharing and a little bit more of the activities that people can see, or the other way around. If it's not carefully designed, you might inadvertently give permissions to a whole group of people that aren't supposed to see what they're seeing, and we'll get to that in a bit. But that's the sort of change that has very wide scope and of course the potential damage in this, at the same level. Here again, this is already the deeper bit, the rules, the business rules. Each one with a code and each one with a 2 or 3 sentence explanation. Over here I see that it was really included, they already included the expressions over here. I think that's a little overly unnecessary. You have that inside the workflow. But the description behind it, if you have a business rule that's about expenses and your manager, you call it BR, ABC, whatever, it doesn't say much in the workflow designer. You look over here, you say, if it's coming from an employee of a certain rank and it has, it's whatever, lower than $1,000, then it will go through a sort of express lane, assuming that that employee will be accountable at a later date in a more aggregated fashion, so that there'll be 30 or 40 expenses and then there'll be a review of all of them. You're not expecting anything. That's the kind of details you would want to put in over here to explain the logic, so that if somebody comes along 2 months later, they'll have an idea what you meant when you created that business rule, what the logic was, and not necessarily what the exact parameter that you sent or received. Messages and recipients. Here also this is pretty straightforward. Who you want to send it to, what the subject is, and what you want to say. Seems trivial, but many times if you prepare this in advance, you can get the idea that, wait a second, I'm sending this message before I know everything that I need to know, and I'm sending the engineer half of the information that they need that they'll need, and then I'm designing an extra loop into my workflow which isn't necessary. In other words, technically it might be able to go around, but if I look at it in advance at a wider perspective, I can see that I can save iterations and save time in the process itself. This, of course, is at the stage when you have all the business people involved. At a higher level, at the workflow level, you can also have a look at your SLAs, your service level agreements and escalations. So when there's when you're looking at the workflow, I can give my own example as the support team manager. That we have, when we built our workflow, we designed it to make it very simple to follow our SLAs. We have a certain response and a relief and resolution time, and our workflow in advance was built so that we can easily collect the information for those reports, for all the reports that the internal reports that we have, rather than going about it later. Once the workflow is ready, then you come and say, wait a second, how am I going to build a report if I didn't collect the information easily? And then you have to start twisting your way around with complicated inner joins and SQL statements, which might have been avoidable if you looked at it in advance in the design stage. The tables, okay, over here it's already SQL table structure with the different types. This really depends on the kind of level you want to put into it. This is again JavaScript methods, different JavaScript methods for invoking different results. Not necessarily applicable to everybody. Over here also, this is for the human interface. You have a list of the forms, their function and description and the type, whether they're single forms or multi-row grids. Again, this is already deep down level details, and although it may look very, very long and overly detailed, this comes in handy later on. If you document it in a structured fashion, then the person that looks at it later doesn't have to reverse engineer what it was that you thought to do, but rather they look over here at the document. The rest of it is already particulars, but I think you get the idea. This or a similar document will save you a great deal of effort when you're looking at the application lifecycle, which we'll get to in a bit, that buzzword. Another important tip, again, it sounds silly, it sounds obvious, but almost all the people that I spoke to, I don't develop workflows on a daily basis. I'm a member of the product team, so I queried around and asked people that develop workflows. One of the most common problems that you have when going into workflow changes is all sorts of good ideas that you have along the way. You have a scope of work that you intend to do, 15 different things, and along the way you see, oh dear, what was it that I was thinking when I prepare this? Usually when it's your own work or your own team's work, what is it that I was thinking when I did this? I can optimize this, I can fix this, I can make it better. And it's extremely tempting to do that. So you need to do either one of two things. If you know about this in advance, then put it into the scope of work, and there'll be a clear expectation of how long it'll take and what the priority is on it. So it's included in the work. If it's not in the scope of work, then you need to stick to the plan, because if you didn't prepare it in advance, if you didn't think it through, it can do one or both of either eating up the time that you have for the change project and pushing you into the red and making you late, or it can have actual detrimental effect, because when the plan was made, there was an assumption of the scope, and you might not be aware of everything, and the positively intended change that you're making over here will not only be a waste of time, it will do damage. So stick to the plan. Before we continue, are there any questions until now? If anybody has any questions, then please write them in through the questions or the chat module. Okay, regarding the backup from before, while I said before, yes, it is true that you can't have too much money or too much backup. We'll get in a bit to the different types of changes and their derived level of backup that you would expect. But it has to be part of the plan in what we're doing. Okay, just 1 second. I want to see if there are any others. Okay, Ricardo, if you can send the questions that you have to the support email, and we'll be happy to assist you. Juan, yes, we will be sharing this a recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint and the Word document. Once after we're done over here, it might be just a little bit delayed until tomorrow. We'll need to clean up the Word document a little bit more. Okay. Another thing you want to look at, again, this is assuming that you don't have sufficient documentation and you're going into the change blind or half blind, is you want to map the change impact on what you're doing over here, be it at the activity or the logical branch or the swim lane level. We'll get to that in a little bit. And an interesting quote that I found was from an article in the computer systems science and engineering, was about change regions. In other words, looking at your workflow and understanding where the problem spots are. I'll show you a workflow. It's a real workflow. Just 1 second. Kind of refresh the session. The browser was left open for a while. I apologize. Gonna need the other one later. I chose this particular workflow because it is exceedingly aesthetically pleasing and very easy to follow. When you look at the overall workflow structure, you can see the clear everything that I intended to speak of earlier. The first thing you want to look at is the workflow as from the inside out. This is a workflow that begins with the form activity. It can be called as a subflow also. And this is the core of the workflow. And you have to assume that a change that you make to here, before you go into the scientific details of it, a change that you make to the form at the core of the workflow will most obviously have more of an impact than the change that you make on one of the outer branches. I don't know, towards the end over here on this assign activity. Statistically speaking, the chances are so, or at an entirely outer branch on the side over here. So when you go about saying, okay, we need to change whatever it is we need to change, your risk estimate, the impact estimate, has to be based on the first parameter: how close to the core am I? The second thing, if you're fortunate enough, again, for the workflow designers to have worked in such an organized fashion, is look at the loops. When you're looking at a change, think about how it will be affected if the workflow does indeed, the more likely or the less, go through the more or less likely loop. Each one of those brings in a complication of itself, different iterations, different timelines, different performances. Think about that when you go about changing. And aside from the loops, the last thing you want to look at over here is the swim lanes. Just one second. The swim lanes in this workflow are obvious. They were prepared for the different aspects of the workflow. The point being, a good example that I was explained was a workflow that was originally designed to go through the IT team and to translate, the abstract request for some technical bit of hardware into layman's terms for a manager what the requirement is. It was the organization found that the IT team was a bottleneck. The average delay time was 2 or 3 days, and they decided to dispense with it. What they needed to prepare was an alternative. Okay, so you don't want it to go through the IT team. There's a reason that it went through there in the first place, through that swim lane, through the IT's swim lane, and that was to get a clear interpretation. If you're not doing that, you have to think of the alternatives. You want to get rid of that swim lane entirely, build something else into the workflow so that it makes sense. So we've covered now the mapping the change impact. So let's go back to our presentation. Sorry, just a second. We covered that the activity, where the activity is located. We covered the logical branch, depending on where we are in the workflow, what the impact is on existing instances, what the impact is on the overall, and the swim lane, the example that we just brought now about the IT. What you want to think of over here, a different way to think of it, is just in 2 words, is a question from a different one of the academic publications. Are your changes syntactic or semantic? If they're in the green, if they're in semantic, then it's very low risk. Usually we'll include in this visual design changes, perhaps even entire site design changes, switching different teams or divisions to different SharePoint sites and different look and feel. And the syntactic changes are the actual logic, the actual changes to business rules, to connections, to speed, and that's what you want to consider. These 2 keywords, syntactic or semantic. So now that we've covered the principles, a list of do's and don'ts in the principles, what I want to do is go over the actual details, what the changes, what your typical changes are, and what you want to consider when you make those changes. The levels, the changes can start at the control level. A single control is a text box or a combo box or a checkbox, whatever, on a particular activity. This is also includes a single field in an XML structure. It can be the wider effect. I brought one example over here of a form, but of course it can be anything at the entire activity level. Changes to the activity level. It could be at the entire workflow level. Again, we'll go into the details later. And what we're going to do now, we're going to cover it. One at a time, in order. Okay, let's have a look at it. At the control level, you can choose, you can need to either modify a field type or downgrade a type from a string to an integer, or delete a control, and less commonly, we're going to get to that, to marking it as not updatable. Both of them have the same effect. Let's have a look at this. This is actually my own support workflow, an older version of it over here. Just a second. All right. As before, this is of course a little less aesthetically pleasing. We have the initial workflow, the initial activity, kickoff activity inside the workflow, and it's very likely, as we said, the outlook, the default values, and everything else. A lot of that will lean on this initial activity. So suppose I decided I'm asking too many questions. Too much information is required of the customers. Not everybody knows what version they're on. I'm nagging with too many questions. I want to remove the version field. I could go about removing it, deleting it, and then seeing what the problem was. But there's an easier way to get an idea. First of all, before I continue with this, you want to start out knowing that your workflow is valid before you begin. So the first thing you want to do is choose, get the latest version of Sequence, and choose the workflow validation option. We're going to use this a lot in the demonstration that we're doing now, and it's worth the patience. It's worth the extra minute or two that it takes. And right now our workflow is valid. There are a few information items, but none of them are in the red. So if we go into the new case and I decide I want to remove the version field, but I want to do it safely. I don't know what the implications of it are. The first suggestion that I can give you: change its name so that it's no longer accessible to the expressions and to everything else, to the business rules down the road, and close it over here and have a look at the validation. While we're waiting for the validation, the most important rule of them all: if you're making changes, do them one at a time. Keep it simple so that you know that it worked before. I made one change and it doesn't work now, then everything that's wrong right now is because of the change that I made. So there's an expression that's based on the name of the field and it doesn't work anymore. There's a field that has a default value, whatever, it depends on this. Go through the list and then you decide, is it vital enough? Is there an alternative? And then change everything over here, either remove it or change it. And when you can go through and there are no more mistakes, or there are no more errors and warnings, then you can delete it permanently. Another thing you'll want to consider is what happens when you do this sort of deletion and then you decide it might have been a mistake. When you go about deleting a field entirely, or even marking it as not updatable, it's actually there are implications in the SQL to this. So if we go on a second to a different workflow where I can do more damage. This is the workflow that this is the data, sorry, for that particular workflow. If we look at form 1 over here, I'm asking people for their name, their age, a date, and a priority, and all that information readily available over here in the database. If I decide at some point I don't want to ask them for their age, I don't care for it for this date of initiation, whatever it is, I don't care to ask them for it anymore. The data is lost. In other words, once I decide to say it's not updatable, we're going to go through two options: either marking it as not updatable or deleting it. So if I decided it's not important, I don't need it, I'm going to get a warning. We dropped from the form data. What that means is, if we mark it as not updatable, then we go back to the database, we have the date DOI, it's no longer there. Now I can put it back. If I marked it as not updatable and I decided I want it nonetheless, I want to keep it, the field is there, but I lost all my data. Same is, of course, applicable if I go ahead and delete the field. All the historical data is lost. And usually the case is, again, unless it was a gross mistake in the original design, we don't like to lose data. So generally speaking over here, you want to consider what you want to keep. And if you need to keep the old data, hide the controls, put it aside somewhere, and you want and keep it. If we go back to the PowerPoint, having covered this particular example, you want to look at a variety of different options over here. If you're looking at the control, just a second. We'll start from the bottom because the last one is actually an example in SQL. If you use information from this control and send it to a web service and you mark it not updatable or you delete it, then the workflows that are already in work can be corrupted because you'll be missing data. The web service consumers pre-compiled the information that needs to be sent, and it will expect a bit of data that's not there. There is no data representation behind it, and it will fail. So you want to consider what you're doing with deletions so that you don't disrupt the web services. Expressions, of course, any expression that's based on a field and you delete it, it won't work. If you have reports, you might not be aware of all the reports that are in the system. We're going to get to that at a higher level. You want to consider that. Keep it in the back of your mind. The UAT table data retention, like we saw before. If the historical information has value, you just don't want it from here on, then you can't just go ahead and delete it. And lastly, the SQL constraints. When you're talking about modifying a field, a typical scenario is when you design the workflow, and you have the age field over here, and you forgot to change it. You left it as a string. And people start, the workflow you have a certain amount of workflows already in action, and all is well. You have the field over here. Now, if any of you have high enough resolution, you'll already see where I'm going with this. And I said, when I go about it the second time, simple change. I want to change it to be an integer. It's a proper data type. That's what people are supposed to be filling in over here. So I'll go ahead and change this to be an integer. When I apply the changes and I go back to the database, it'll tell me, can't do it for you because, in this case, just one person, conversion failed when changing the value 49 dash. Somebody accidentally typed in 49 dash as a string field. It works perfectly fine. But it, as an integer, can't convert it, and the change of the field type is therefore disrupted. When you're talking about large amounts of data, of course, this becomes a bigger problem. You want to consider the options. You can do a manual review of the data and fix it, or you can consider others. But you want to keep it a clear idea of what's going on. So if it's relatively simple as it is over here, we know what the person meant. We know what they meant to fill. They meant to fill out the number 49, and it just was probably a typo that had this added in. There's no minus 49. So if we put that in, if we put that through over there, and we try to apply the change again, it worked perfectly well. It became an integer, and if we go back to the database and refresh it, right now it's in varchar. We go ahead and refresh it, and moved up to there, sorry, and now it's an integer. So it worked perfectly fine as long as the data is in place. Are there any questions up to this point, please? Let's see. Is there a version of the activity of the version feature is only for the whole workflow? We're going to get to versioning at the end, but I won't keep you in suspense. No, there is no version for just a single activity. We're going to get to versioning in the end. If you already asked, everything that we're assuming over here until this point is changing an existing workflow. And there are reasons. We built the workflow versioning option for very good reasons, but we'll get to those in the end. We'll cover those in the end. Okay. So we finished the control. We'll go one level up to the activity. You might think if you have a workflow somewhere along the chain, and for the business reason you don't need it, there is no implication, the swim lanes are fine, we can do perfectly fine without it, whatever reason, and you go ahead and delete it. One of the things you'll find is that deleting an entire activity can have at least two detrimental effects. First of all, all the dependencies on the controls inside of it are of course lost because they no longer make any sense. There is no activity, and so there's no reference to the controls inside it. Expressions, statistics, variables, etc., are all disrupted. And another important thing to understand is the principle of the sequence engine. Now, we're not going into the depths of that because we could spend a few days on that. But one important thing to know is every activity in sequence has a reference. In other words, who created me and who I created. In other words, which activity was my predecessor, so that activity finished and it pushed the workflow forward and created me. And in turn, who's following me, who's connected to me, and who I created. Now, if you have a scenario in which you delete an activity and you have workflow instances which are waiting just after that activity to be created, the activity after that, the engine goes ahead and says, okay, I'm about to create you. I'm going to check who's the activity that was closed. And if the activity is no longer there, then the engine will break. Because if there is nothing, if there is no reference to write in as the creator, then it will break the workflow instance and the workflow won't be able to continue. Now, there are a few ways around it. If anybody has any particular questions, we'll be happy to assist with case by case. One way about it is to say, okay, we'll do this in 2 phases. We'll just disengage the activity from the place and leave it on the workflow canvas so that all the references to it stay alive, but they're no longer relevant in the new workflows. And then the next time around, when all the instances are done, we can delete it entirely. Another option is if you know where your workflows are, if you can actually control the location, the actual pointer points on your workflow, so you know that none of my workflows are waiting at this point, then you can delete the activity with impunity whenever it is you want to. One second. We're going to get to the testing, but just in 2 words, I shouldn't forget. It's all about the simulation. We'll get to that once we get to the testing. It's all about the testing and following all the available scenarios. At the workflow level, you can do a lot of adding and moving and deleting of links. I hope you understood that from the silly chain icon. And when you're going about changing links in workflows, you really have to consider the effect mostly on working workflow instances. A lot of times when you're changing a workflow, you're thinking about what your upcoming goal is. I wanted to do something. I wanted to do ABC, and you forget what it is that you intended to. There are workflows already in process, and you might be missing them. You might be messing up with them. So, for instance, suppose you have a heavy activity after which you want to send a message to somebody. You connect the message activity, and then all current workflow instances, if you leave it as it is, everybody that has a workflow that's waiting just at that point to be finished will retroactively get messages, and it can be a big bundle of messages if there are a great number of workflows open. So you want to do this. You want to check the implications of what you're doing and connect the activities in such a way, either, again, monitoring where your workflow is or if necessary, with a business rule, so that messages only go out for the new workflows and not for the older version of the workflows. While we're going along, I have a question. Is there a mechanism for undoing mistakes that you made, a recycle bin or something like that? Unfortunately not. In other words, the short answer is unfortunately not. All the changes that are made are propagated to the database relatively quickly, and it's not practical at this time to have a recycle bin or functionality like it. Like I said, if you work slowly, if you go through by first changing the controls and then continuing, and if you keep backups, so that on your dev environment you get an idea of what you're doing, you make a change, and you keep a backup before each major change. I'm sorry, just 1 second. Sorry, and you make a backup before each major change. It's the best that we can offer. So we talked about adding the excess activities that you can have created. Moving links around or changing them so that perhaps the link that's now redirected all, which means it's redirected by both by the synchronous engine and by the asynchronous background engine. You might say, okay, I need to speed things up for whatever reason. I'm going to change it so that only the asynchronous engine pushes it forward. The workflow will work, but the behavior, you might have had a workflow that was wizard-like, so that the person had 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 forms, one after each other, that they can go through backwards or whatever. They can fill out as a wizard. And if you break that, then you break the person's line of thought. If a person has to fill, if it was designed to be filled out all at once, and you change a link, it'll work, but you might have possibly reduced the efficiency of the workflow. More importantly, moving and deleting links, you have to think of the implications of getting workflow instances stuck. And the last thing is the intervals. One of the places that are most commonly tweaked to affect performance is usually lengthening the intervals between activities or BRS runs or whatever it is to help performance. So if you have it running every 5 minutes and you want to give your SQL a breather, you'll push it up to 15 minutes. There are a great deal of implications to this. There are SLAs you want to consider. If your workflow is designed to work quickly, to tick through quickly, and you triple the interval between activities, then everybody can continue to work at the same pace, putting their best into it. And because of a system problem, you can be modifying the way the work gets done, and you'll be affecting your SLA. Again, on the other way, you can try and crunch it back down to the minimum. But if you have a high impact system, then not everything can go through with high intervals. It's something you want to keep in mind when you're looking at the design. We're about to go through the last level and then out into the last principles. If anybody has any questions, then please do put them through the questions or the chat area, and I'll be happy to answer. Okay, just the one. Again, the performance tweaking as a whole, we had a webinar about it. I think it was just the last one, and it's a whole separate matter. We're only looking at the aspect over here of changing the performance and what it might do to the bigger picture of the SLAs. If you have any particular questions, then we'll be happy to assist offline. The highest level that you want to look at is the BPM level, not just your workflow, the scope of the workflow that you were given to update, to change, but the highest level, the whole BPM, the biggest perspective view of everybody, whatever everybody's doing together. There are interactions between different workflows, so that the most minor change you make in some activity on your workflow can have a butterfly effect and can affect things outside of the scope of the workflow. There are reports that might depend on what you're looking at. There are charts that the executives are looking at, aggregative charts that can stop working or can give, or worse, if they stop working, you at least know there's a problem, or can give skewed data if you delete fields, and also in a variety of different MRS reports and views for executive views that can be skewed or entirely rendered inoperative. So when you're looking at this is again, if you go hark back to the beginning, to the business, this is the place where the business representatives will give their share. They will know, yes, we have a report ABC. They don't care about the details, but they'll be able to tell you, at the very least, you'll know, look at report 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you'll see, and check them for validity. Check that they work and check that the data is valid. That's a typical scenario that you'll have in real life. In the real life. Now that we've gone through again all the activities down from the single control all the way to the BPM level, a few last pointers and sort of items for thought and food for thought. The workflow is contained in itself, but there are a variety of satellites that work around it, and you want to keep yourself aware of what you have to do with the different types. If you depend on some function, some SQL function that's not part of the workflow, then you want to make sure you insert it into the external object. Let's have a quick look at the actual doing of that. In this case, we'll look at the physical file, but it is more or less the same thing. You have the database object that you can browse through. You need to know the name, and you have the file system objects. Anything that's under C program files, PNM soft shared resources that's actually looked at from both of course from the workflow runtime and from the workflow administration. This is the shared resources folder. If you look at it on the server, if the server will move. This is the content of it. Components configuration. Usually, it's about XSLTs and JavaScript and image files. This is the place you would create a reference to whatever it is you want, and add the file over here. That way, when the workflow travels between the different systems, if you change something, if you customized something, if you added something, this is the place to keep. This is the place to keep the information. Other items that cannot get carried across, and again should be part of the tasks, the workflow migration tasks, are operating system files, physical files that are outside of shared resources for any reason, and more commonly global assembly cache, DLLs that you have in the GAC, in the global assembly cache. When you're migrating workflows, you can use all sorts of tools, deployment tools for custom DLLs, or just drag and drop them, as it says over here in the icon. But the one thing you want to be careful of is keep a checklist. It's usually very short. What needs to be done when the workflow is transitioned between environments. Here again, a few things. They might sound obvious, but many times we've seen disruptions that are caused because of this. You should develop in the development environment and use exactly the same zip. Deploy it to the test, deploy it to the user acceptance test, to the UAT environment, and to production. A common mistake is to deploy it to test and then to say, oh wait, I have some stuff that I want to do, and to tweak it in the test environment and take that one and deploy it somewhere else. And what you have then is when you get to production, you have something else from what you have in development. And when there's a problem, you go back. You don't want to test. You don't want to do your messing around in production. You go back to development, and it doesn't behave the same way because the zip switched hands along the way. Keep the same zip, and in the same breath, there's usually a convention by each organization how you go about it. The name, the author, the date that it was stamped, or whatever. It's a good idea to keep a standardized naming convention. It makes it a lot easier to push to move the information around. Another important aspect of testing. What works on a new workflow doesn't necessarily work on an old workflow. You can't always teach an old dog new tricks, and so when you're testing a workflow, especially in the late stages, you want to work with data that's as real as possible that you can get. One option, and again, it's sometimes possible, not always possible for a variety of reasons, if you can copy your database from production to UAT, then you have it made. Because what you have over there is the maximum amount of workflows with a very likely spread of all the different configurations, locations that the workflow could be located at any given time. And if you can test on those, if you can test on that full list of full array of options, and they all work and they all push forward, then you're fine. If you can't do it, then the next best is to sit down and think how you want to simulate it. 1 or 2 workflow instances for each different setup where the workflow can be waiting at different stages, and test with those to make sure that they make sense, that the change makes sense. Again, depending on how prevailing the change is. You don't have to do that for each tiny change. And a last point is, don't make the same mistake twice. I've seen it so many times where we come to production, there's a bug, and somebody always says, I think I saw that in test. I thought we fixed that. But we didn't fix it because you saw it and it wasn't documented, it got forgotten, and it was forgotten about, and and it didn't get fixed. And that's the most frustrating type of bug. The one that you saw and that you thought you knew about it, you thought was fixed, and it wasn't done. The trick to this is application lifecycle management tools, which are in essence just tracking tools for what needs to be done, what are bugs, what are nice to haves, what are changes. Visual Studio 2010 has an application lifecycle management tool. The older version have the TFS, the Team Foundation server. There are a dozen different tools that you can use over here. You could even a well-organized Excel file is also good. But keep track of the changes. If you find a bug, then make sure that there's a clear path to having it fixed, so that you don't regret it later on. And the last item on our list. Excuse me, just 1 second. I apologize. Is, if you'll notice that I didn't mention at the beginning of this workflow, only now we'll get to it, I didn't even mention the option of workflow versioning, duplicating the workflow. The reason I didn't was quite purposefully. I prepared the PowerPoint in advance. It's because versioning has its upsides, and it has its problems. First of all, if we look at the principle behind it, usually the workflow versioning is about when you want up until this point to behave one way, and from this point and onwards to behave differently. In other words, like the joke says, I divide my life into 2 parts, till I met you and after I met you. So if the implications that you have over here are temporal, which means whatever from now on I want something else to happen, and whatever was will continue to behave as it was, especially the existing workflow instances, then you'll probably want to seriously consider versioning the workflow. On the other hand, you want to consider that when you use the versioning, you're introducing a different type of complication. On the one hand, yes, when you're versioning, collateral damage is less likely. If I put in a new version, then I don't have to consider all the different changes to the business rules and the removing of fields and adding of fields or whatever, because the old stuff will continue to work the old way. And and that brings down the likelihood of collateral damage, of unintentional damage, brings it down dramatically. On the other hand, when you're versioning a workflow, you're actually creating a new workflow template. It looks the same and it quacks the same, but it has a different ID. It's a new workflow version template. It's a workflow template, and they're shared. The commonality between them is the workflow space, which is shared between them, so that everything that happened before behaves as before, and the new ones. From the SQL point of view, from reports and charts and everything else, it's a little bit more difficult to handle, because if you're looking at queries that are meant to look for a workflow template ID of whatever, now you have to change your SQLs to fit into the new scenario. Now, of course, it's not a great big problem, because you're looking at the periodical changes. Normally, a workflow is constantly, the demand for it to change is dynamic, and there's always something new happening. Business changes, and the whole point of having a system like ours is to make the change, to make it as undramatic as possible. So things are constantly moving. You can keep track of the workflow instances and say, okay, At any given time, I'll have whatever active workflows from 2 or 3 generations, and I know that the older workflows have to be done within a week or two, so that you can update the whatever dependencies according to that, as long as you understand where the dependencies are and what they need to be. So I think we covered the broader view, the inner details of the workflow change management, the issues, the solutions, the challenges, and everything else. And I'd like to ask if anybody has any questions before we're done. Then I'll be happy to answer. Okay, there seems to be right now just the one. Yes, so deploying duplicated workflows is very simple. If anybody, it's available in the user guide. If anybody would like a quick demonstration online, then we'll be more than happy to set up a GoToMeeting and to demonstrate exactly how it's done. All right then. Are there any more questions? All right, everyone. We'll be sending a post-webinar survey later on today or early tomorrow, and very much appreciate it if you could all fill it out. Any feedbacks that you have, any requested future topics, etc., etc. I'd appreciate it greatly if you can return it. And thank you all very much for your participation.